we've talked a bit about this, but talking about attitude. 2 years ago, right about now, we were at a memorial service for my Annie Mildred. And Annie Mildred passed away 6 weeks before her 103rd birthday. Annie Mildred was a really neat lady, and at the funeral, my cousins were there, all her children, and it was kind of funny because at the time my cousins were, the youngest was 64 and the oldest was 82, and the kids were all at the funeral. And it wasn't a funeral, it was a memorial service talking about my Annie Mildred, and the kids all talked about this Mildred factor. Annie Mildred was born in Hamilton, and the day she was born, it was horse and buggy going through the streets of Hamilton. She lived through everything from the man on the moon to the technology changes to everything that went on until she was 103. She was a minister's wife, grew up in the United Church. My Uncle Alan was a minister, and so she had every reason to, be not unhappy about certain things. Particularly, having grown up in the United Church, we lived in a manse, and so most of my youth, until I was about 15 years old, once a year my mother went to the manse committee and said, "Can we paint these walls? Can we buy some furniture, whatever?" My mother was dictated what we could or couldn't do in our home. And my Annie Mildred, her whole life in the church was based around that. Well, she learned how to take a can of paint and turn it into magic. She learned how to sew. She did all sorts of things. But Annie Mildred became one of those people, she would walk into a room and change the behavior in the room. And it didn't matter who was in the room. She could walk into a soup kitchen in downtown Toronto when they were in Toronto, or she could walk into a black tie event. That was Annie Mildred. And part of that Mildred factor was she just saw another person in front of her. She didn't care about your status. She didn't care who you were. She really sat and spent the time. More importantly, as she got older, several things around it. And I come from that gene pool, so I sort of said to people, I'm 50 years old, I said, I'm not even halfway there based on how our gene pool goes, because Annie Mildred was 103, my grandfather died a few years ago at 100, Uncle Jim was 104 on the farm out in Saskatchewan, and they just, my family just keeps living. It's the Irish and Scottish, I think it's the whiskey and the Guinness, but with Annie Mildred, at 102, Annie Mildred was in Belmont House for, and I forget how many years she was at Belmont House. And Belmont House in Toronto is one of those progressive homes now where you can start right up to palliative care. Annie Mildred never made it to palliative care. At 102, they'd wander around the Belmont House going, Mildred's not here. Annie Mildred would, middle of an afternoon, go, come on, ladies, and she'd grab 2 or 3 ladies, they go and hail a taxi, and they go down to the King Eddie for high tea. Because that's what you do at 102. You don't sit around the nursing home feeling sorry for yourself. Or another day she'd go, yeah, we're kind of bored, let's go shopping. They'd hail a taxi and they'd head down to the Eaton Center, wander around the Eaton Center and go shopping for the afternoon. At 102. Wow. Or 100 or 99, but all through. She was not one of these people sitting in a rocking chair going, she was out making it happen. When Annie Mildred was 72, she started a fashion show with UCW at Kingsway Lantern Church in Toronto. When she was 102, it was the 30th anniversary. They invited her to come to the fashion show. And true Annie Mildred fashion, she came to the fashion show, but she didn't just sit and watch the fashion show. She went down the runway 3 times in 3 different outfits, because that's what you do at 102. She was part of the fashion show. So I always say to people, and particularly to salespeople, what attitude are you taking out the door with you every day? What's the attitude you're taking out? Do you go home at the end of the day after a long day and walk through the door and kick the cat and yell at the kids and yell at your wife and then settle in? When you get into the office after you've been cut off, after you've driven through traffic and all that, what attitude are you taking in? And then what attitude are you taking to your customers? Most importantly with that, attitude is all ours. Each one of you owns your attitude. Not the weather, not the Prime Minister, not your wife, not your kids, not your friends, not your parents, not even God himself or herself. You own your attitude. And so what are we doing about that? Oh, it's terrible out there, the economy's awful, I'm never going to make any money. That's your perception of the world. You can change that. So what are you doing to change that? And here's the one clue for everybody. Changing your attitude. You make just a subtle change in your attitude and how you look at the world, and everybody notices it. Okay. The other thing is, everybody loved to hang around Annie Mildred. Everybody. Didn't matter who you were. Loved hanging around with her. Why did you like hanging around with her? Because she was lots of fun. She had that right attitude. Why do you like I always say to people, why do you like hanging around with top salespeople? Because they're fun to be around. They're optimistic. They're there. They make it happen. And if you're out at the bars, they always pick up the tab.
True.
But they have that attitude that you like being around them.
Because everyone else is too depressed to pick up the tab.
Yeah. But poor performing reps will come up, you put people in the same situation, exactly the same, and there's those people that can turn it into gold and make it happen, and other people that say all they see is the underbelly of it all. Exact same situation. The biggest challenge for people in the last 6 months has been able to look at that. I mean, this is my third recession, or call it whatever we're going to call it. And this one has been, I'm told, has been the worst so far. Now, I'm not sure about that. The other thing that has driven me crazy through this one is, it was at a political event recently, and God knows we've had, even you guys from a standpoint of elections, like, must be retiring, because every time you turn around, there's another election. We missed this one, there'll be another one in November probably. But as we go through it, it is understanding this recession hasn't touched as many people the way it has. And we're at this political event, and they were talking about this depression. And I almost jumped up and said, everybody in this room is going home tonight to their LCD, HD, flat screen TV to watch the hockey playoffs. Unlike my mother or my father, who dad in Ireland went home to a dirt floored shack during the 30s, or my mother who was on a farm in Saskatchewan where they literally had to put blankets over the windows in the windstorms to stop the dust into the house. It was a whole different, this isn't a depression. Maybe in terminology it is, but it is nothing to what my parents and many of your parents would have lived through. It's all about attitude. I've had to qualify this because I've said to people, I don't want to sound Pollyanna about this, but the reality is, unemployment rates have just hit 8%. They were 12 and 13%. People's mutual funds in 1987 got wiped out by 50% almost overnight during that October of 1987. I'm a bit of a pack rat. This past Christmas, I was going through some boxes and I found the Globe and Mail from the Toronto Globe and Mail. God, it was a broadsheet in those days, and the pages were all yellow. But October 21st and October 23rd, 1987. And I wandered in the kitchen, I started reading, I said, honey, I just got the paper. And I read two articles from the front page of the Globe and Mail on October 21st, 1987. And my wife said, that's unbelievable, it's getting worse. I said, honey, it's 1987. You could have read that. In fact, I read through the paper, and if you didn't know any better, you would have thought it was 2009. The stories, the articles, the way they were written, if you just printed it and sent it off to friends and said, hey, I found this article in the Globe, they would have said, well, that's unbelievable, and would have circulated it. 1987. So about that attitude is, how are we looking at that situation? And listen, I don't profess for people to walk around. I always say that Willie Wonderful, that, hey, how are you, nice to see you, or Susie Sunshine, hey, there we go. You're medicated at that point, okay? You're fully medicated. You can't be that way every day, all right? So we have good days. We have bad days. Remember those babies in diapers. We are who we are. When you're having a bad day, what do you need to do to deal with it? And if you're having a really bad day, go for a walk on the boardwalk and feed the birds. If you've got grandchildren,